Hey all bitches, you know how I'm in graduate school for counseling? Well, this weekend I was planning to start a series about computers to teach you all about the basics of them, and instead of doing that I was swamped by a heavily procrastinated last-minute presentation about a sexual disorder of my choosing. So in the interest of killing two birds with a single very heavy stone, I am going to tell you everything I know so far about gender identity disorder. Okay, so before I start talking about the disorder, it's really important to talk about the concept of gender itself. Hank Green already did a pretty good video of it, and you can click it right here, but here's a really super quick version of it. So this diagram over here is my version of the model of sexual identity. At the top we've got biological sex based on genetic karyotype, basically a combination of chromosomes that determine whether you're male or female or intersex. Down on the left you've got gender, which is a set of attributes and behaviors linked with, but not necessarily bound to, your biological sex. There are things considered masculine or feminine, but unlike sex, there's a lot of in-betweens and also neithers. And then we have gender roles, which are societal expectations about what kinds of behaviors and choices and whatever a person of a certain gender is allowed to have. Gender roles can also be very distinct from the other concepts. For example, a very feminine man can still be into fixing and driving cars. Back up at the top is sexual orientation, which is all about the sex of the person that one is attracted to. For the purpose of this discussion, sexual orientation is almost irrelevant. It's not really a part of this gender piece, even if it is a factor when it comes to gender roles and vice versa. Its distinctness can be illustrated by the fact that a person who is born female and identifies as masculine, who wears jeans and plays baseball, if he falls in love with men, he would still be considered gay. Technically. I've never met a person who fits that description, but hey, if that's you, let's be friends. You sound really interesting. It's also important to know some of the terminology. Transgender, or trans for short, is a person with an atypical gender identity, which could include people who feel like they're in between or none of the above. Transsexuals are specifically people who identify with the gender opposite to their assigned sex, so like people who are born male but identify as feminine, or born female and identify as men. Meanwhile, a person who doesn't have an atypical gender identity, the vanilla people, they're referred to as cisgender, which on Tumblr is pretty much an insult apparently. Whatever. Anyway, in the Diagnostics and Statistics Manual, 4th edition TR, gender identity disorder is when there is a disagreement between the biology and the gender the person identifies with. Well, actually, there are 4 criteria in order to be diagnosed with that disorder. Criteria A. Atypical gender identity. Wanting to be or identifying with a gender that isn't the default for your sex. Criteria B, the desire must not be about culturally perceived advantage. For example, ladies in our culture may sometimes wear pantsuits because it's a signal that they want to be treated equally to men. Does not mean that they have a gender identity disorder. Instead, the person should have a deep-seated feeling that they are in the wrong body, is the common thing that people say. Criteria C, the issue is not related to being intersex, because that's a completely separate thing. Criteria D, and this is really important, significant distress. It's super important to understand that not all people living with atypical gender identity will inevitably have the disorder. They have to genuinely feel like it's negatively impacting their life. Now, there are lots of theories about how all this actually happens. Honestly, with almost everything in psychology, it's a matter of nature and nurture working together. Case in point, there are 3 theories on how atypical gender identity happens at all. Number 1 theory, but not actually the most important, it's about hormones in the womb. We don't know exactly what kinds of hormones or what's actually happening, but scientists have noticed that trans people tend to have physical characteristics similar to their identifying gender, which are controlled by hormones. Things like the ratio of the length of your fingers, or being left-handed for those who are male to female. So we know that there's a link to hormones somewhere, we just don't know where that link is, so there's no causality, just correlation. Number 2, neurological differences. Trans brains are structurally different from those of their cisgender counterparts. Number 3 is genetics. We don't actually know which genes per se, but we have found out a lot from twin studies. For example, if one twin is transgender, the other twin is highly likely to be one as well, and the likelihood is greater between identical twins than in fraternal twins. But like I said before, just because there's atypical gender identity doesn't mean that there's actually a disorder. Remember that criteria D is all about the distress. There are all sorts of cultures around the world that are totally okay with trans people. They just think of them differently, like the Fa'afine of the Samoans or the Berdache of the Native Americans. When they're integrated into society and valued for who they are, you can't really say that they have a disorder, can you? However, in our own society, and Western culture in general, trans people aren't really accepted. That is of course changing, but there's still a long way to go, and that has generated some problems. Or let me talk about it this way. Here's an iceberg of the human mind, according to the psychodynamic model. Here's the id, deep in the subconscious, all about desires and needs. The id feels that it is feminine and wants to do lady things and be a lady, thank you. But the superego, also partially in the subconscious, is delving into memory and thinking, well, no. One has a penis, and there are societal expectations bound to that. So they both go to the ego, which is the part of the mind that makes the decisions and checks with reality. Because it's a difficult decision to make, the ego goes into cognitive dissonance. There is stress and anxiety and generally feeling bad. And that's basically how you end up with a gender identity disorder. Now, treating GID is different from most other disorders, which is why in the next DSM, DSM-5, which is coming out soon, the shrink bosses want to rename it a gender identity dysphoria, which leans more on thinking of it as a disagreement in realities rather than a disease. In fact, standard issue nowadays, even in crazy strict places like Iran, is to affirm the desire rather than to just get rid of it. This is usually the realm of psychotherapy, which is what I want to specialize in, where resolving the issue is mostly done by talking about and unraveling the emotions and then expressing them. Side note, one interesting thing that I've actually found out is that there are 2 separate diagnoses for children and adults with GID. Statistically speaking, kids with GID most likely will resolve their issue and identify it instead as homosexual cisgender, followed by heterosexual cisgender. Only a small number of children with GID end up as transgender adults. The thing is that a lot of the time, though not all of the time, expressing the desire means going through with gender reassignment by hormones and surgery, and only then can the person finally be him or herself. I am exhausted. I think I'm experiencing homework completion dysphoria. I'll just see you guys next week.